Software design is something I found quite hard to get to grips with early in my career, and I realised eventually that one of the reasons for that was that a lot of the people who write about software design try and equate it with traditional engineering design, whilst at the same time having not the slightest clue about traditional engineering design. Over the years, I've come up with a process that works quite well for me, and in practice, for the sort of small projects I've always worked on, never been part of a big software team, that a lot of the design does take place in your head. But um, you know, the documentation of traditional software design or big company software design is often more about communicating between different layers of the group and communicating from a designer to a programmer. And small projects with only one or most two programmers just don't need that sort of level of documentation. However, there are sometimes situations where it's useful to use some sort of documented design or to sketch something out on paper to get your ideas together. And in this video, I'm going to try and describe a little bit about my approach and use a couple of examples from my sequencer rather than just doing a video on the sequencer design, which I realized was going to be rather boring because most of it's just in my head. And also the other slightly bad thing about this is I realized I was getting stuck worrying about making this video I promised to make rather than actually getting down and doing the programming. So this video is that video, but slightly changed to be more about my general approach to software design. First, just a couple of quotes from Code Complete, which is, in these days, most of the stuff we do in software is on the internet, but this is a book that's worth getting if you're a younger programmer, want to learn some good general principles. But anyway, Steve McConnell on projects says, on large formal projects, design is often distinct from other activities, such as requirements analysis or coding. And then a couple of other paragraphs on small informal projects. A lot of design is done while the programmer sits in front of the keyboard. And that reflects the reality for me. Most of the time, pre-programming part of design is conceptual thinking in the head. Very little goes on paper. But it's not, there is often something, especially if, well, when I had a job, when I was still working, if I was writing a piece of software for administrators to make use of, I would sit with them and go through the process and create a plan so that I knew exactly what they wanted and they knew what I could deliver. However, McConnell also sees in other places in the book, it's clear he thinks design doesn't involve software construction. He sees construction as something separate, and I think that's just misunderstanding engineering design. So engineering design in the traditional say, this is from Wikipedia, some common stages of engineering design. And it's not that different from doing software design. But a few of these things might, well, I'm not sure that order is particularly meaningful, but if I go on to a slightly modified version of that for software design, concept generation, thinking up what you're going to create is the first thing to me. Research, developing or finding out what exists, what you can reuse, what specifications you should be using, etc. Requirements gathering, I prefer to the other terms. Feasibility checking. Sometimes Usually not, actually, with small software projects. And then the bit which is usually called design in software equates to preliminary design in traditional engineering, and code writing is the detailed design. Because when you do, as an engineer, as I once was, when you do a design, that thing on the piece of paper, in my day, these days on a computer, has everything, and the people who you hand it off to, who do the turn that into a physical artifact, don't, if you give it to two different teams, they will produce exactly the same thing because every single detail's there. That's why code writing is not the same as construction. What the compiler does is construction. Code writing is the real detailed design. So in my MIDI project, concept generation, I pretty much covered this in the last video. I'm going to make a headless sequencer. The reason I'm doing this is largely because I've had lots of false starts, and it was the user interfaces that always seemed to just go wrong. I realized I didn't like it, and so I'm going to make it without a user interface at all, and make this user interface a separate project later, or very minimalist that will be supported in this, using MIDI controllers such as this one. Um, it will be a sort of performance-oriented sequencer, so the sequences will be organized into channels. Probably I'll default to 8 because these controllers have 8 rows of buttons, and then sequences that can be switched between in each channel. So very much like the circuit tracks does, but with longer sequences. There's a few other things I've planned. The sequences will be either obviously drums or tone, but it doesn't matter because MIDI signals are the same. But tone ones I might allow transpose. So I've got the concept. It's mostly in my head. There's a few scraps on paper. Some of it is also in the bits I'm reusing from old failed projects. Research for this project. Research would typically involve looking up standards and files, finding reusable code libraries. So in this instance, I've found this library called Managed MIDI, which provides the MIDI support for Raspberry Pi in C#. C# I chose because it's a language I'm familiar with, and I used to program in C++, but so long ago, language has greatly changed. C# just seemed better, even though C++ is probably a more typical language for something like MIDI. One challenge with C# I'm going to have to watch out for is I can't let it do garbage collection randomly. It's got to be a bit managed, but I think that's going to be okay. And learning how to use C# for ARM Linux, that was basically 5 minutes on the internet and a wee tiny test project which took 10 minutes, but it was part of this research for me and this project. Requirements gathering, typically, with a project for an employer, you'd be talking to end users and things like that. And you create use cases. There's a very good book by Alistair Coburn about use cases, which is worth reading if you ever want to use them as a way of developing. Like, basically, you're developing a story which you can then check against the software. So I also find really many use cases useful, just basically saying, there is this thing I need to be able to do. Just so that it's there, I keep it in mind. And sometimes, this is again, different projects need different things, but UML sequence diagrams I have found very useful, particularly for web projects. Feasibility. In this project, I did a test app. My little MIDI router app I mentioned in the last video. It runs well in a Pi 3. That gives me reasonable certainty the project's going to work out. And my preliminary design. I've done this UML diagram slightly to get my thoughts together, and it also makes me realize there's quite a lot here, which is there's a lot of communications, but interesting, useful bits to know. There's a thing called, where is it? Event Mapper. And this is almost the heart of this application. It's just going to be one singleton class which every event goes to and everything else can listen to. And that means things like two different MIDI controllers that need to receive different like messages to change a light when something changes, can be listening through their MIDI controller manager, and they will receive the message from that wherever it has come from. So that is also, though, just being reused from a previous thing, as is most of this. So the main class is going to be this thing called a multi-sequence, which is basically a channel. It's a list of simple sequences, which is just a very short sequence, or up to an arbitrary length. I would typically probably have no more than 16 bars, but I'm not going to make that fixed. A sequence consists of note events. Chord events I haven't fully thought through, but they'll go in there sometime. And control events like changing a controller or changing the filter. There will be an overall concept of a composition. That again, I'm leaving some of that planning till later, but that will be to create a performance probably. Well, performance will be part of that, which would be almost me sitting there pressing the buttons and recording in real time. And the MIDI all comes in through a control mapper, and the router program is still there as the core, sending the MIDI messages out. So the design's sort of there, but largely in my head. It's far from finished because some of it will happen as I code. So the next thing is to get on to the coding. At the moment, I've set something up on my computer. There's not enough there to make it worth sharing it. But fairly soon I'll get it into a state where it's worth having it on GitHub, even if it's not fully working. And that will be the name. So SequiCraft is the name I've decided for this project, and it will be under my directory, Neil B. And I'm probably going to release this on a GPL license. I might go for something more liberal like MIT. I need to check the libraries are compatible with different licenses, but I think it will probably be GPL, so you can take it and do anything you want with it, but I retain the copyright. So that's it for now. I won't do any more videos about this sequencer project until there's actually something worth showing, because I've sort of ended up in this silly situation of worrying about making this video instead of getting on with writing the software. So from now on, as far as this theme on my video channel goes, this is the last video for a wee while until I have something sequencer-wise worth showing off. Okay, thanks for watching. Please give my channel a follow if you're interested in this stuff, and I will be posting further about this sequencer eventually, but in the interim I might be doing some other videos and other stuff, maybe playing with my little Behringer synths or something.